Hi everyone, today's video is a part 2 of a tutorial series of how I customize my figures from beginning to end, step by step. In this video, I'm going to go over hand painting your base coats on your figures with acrylics. In part 1, I went over taking your figure apart and preparing it for painting, so go check that out if you want to find out more. Like the name suggests, the base coat is the foundation for the paints of your figure, and how well it's applied can influence the quality of the final product, particularly choosing good colors and adding enough coats of paint to be opaque enough not to see any of the brush strokes underneath. While adding highlights can really make a figure pop, paint is actually relatively translucent, so the colors of the base coat underneath can influence the colors of the highlights. This is what you'll need for today's video. Everything I'm using in this series is linked in the description below, and be sure to subscribe so you know when the next part of this tutorial is coming out. Oh, an asterisk for folks watching is that this is how I paint my figures. There are a ton of more experienced painters that might watch my video and might say that I'm doing things wrong, so check the comments for different and maybe better techniques. The first step is to choose your colors. If you're just starting out, the best way is to find a reference photo of what colors you want to use. You can take a screenshot of it, pull up the color picker in the editor, select the dropper tool, and hover over the shadow section. This will basically be your base coat color. Even if you can't match the color exactly, at least it gives you an idea of the shade you need. For this Goku, I'm using Vallejo Model Color and Game Color acrylics. I really enjoy them as they offer great color selection and generally have good coverage. The variety packs I have linked are a great starting point for pretty much everyone. Before we start using any paint, make sure it's well shaken since the pigment can separate from the medium if it's brand new or if you haven't used it in a while. I've picked up this mini vortex mixer, and once you place a metal mixing ball inside the bottle, you can let the machine do all the mixing for you by just putting it on here and letting it sit for about 30 seconds. This is totally optional, but it's something that I use pretty regularly. For the skin's base coat, I'm using in flat flesh. Once it's all shaken up, I put a few drops of paint in the mixing plate, and then add a few drops of thinner medium in about a 2-to-1 ratio of paint to thinner, and mix it together. This helps improve the spread of paint and decreases brush strokes without breaking any of the binders or other components that help keep the whole thing together. You can add more thinner for even easier application, but keep in mind as you add more thinner, the opacity of the paint goes down, which then would require more layers of paint. You can definitely play with the amount that works best for you. And speaking of layers, something to keep in mind is to be patient and to paint in multiple thin layers and waiting for each layer to dry rather than trying to finish everything in one coat. It'll end up looking incredibly sloppy and brush strokes will be visible. I don't have a particular direction that I go in. I just try to spread the paint out as much as I can to make sure that there are no lumps. So if you see me brushing over an area multiple times, it's to spread the paint out a little bit more. It takes about 1 hour or so for the paint to dry. So to make the best use of my time, I paint one layer of each color at a time. So once the first layer of skin is done, I'll move on to the hair. Out of all the Vallejo yellows I have, I found that this sun yellow has the most pigment, so this is the one to use. As I mentioned in part 1, yellow paint has notoriously bad opacity, so it would take multiple coats to get a solid layer of yellow without brush strokes leaking through. To help mitigate the amount of coats of paint I needed, I primed these areas in yellow. Even though the amount of pigment is very low, I still have to add thinner to thin out the binders and other components of the paint. I also had a little leftover paint, so I applied the first layer of yellow on his eyebrows and sideburns to minimize any waste. Next up, we'll paint the ghee orange. I'll do the same mixing process as I did for the previous colors, and this time using a larger paintbrush. Orange is very similar to yellow in that the pigment is very thin, and it didn't help that this bootleg figure had this weird texture in the cloth, so paint would get trapped inside the crevices, and it took some extra time to spread out and even out. I'll say this up front that I wish I used an airbrush for this, as the application would have gone much faster, but I'm a little bit too lazy to start. Or maybe it's stubbornness. So instead of following my steps here, you can just use this section as a PSA to learn how to airbrush. Anyway, after going over the broader areas with a large brush, I went in with a smaller one to catch any uneven areas I may have missed. I'll also use this opportunity to say that when you start, painting with a premixed color is really handy because you don't have to worry about much waste. I managed to go through a couple paint pours of the same color, and I didn't even have to think of any proportions for mixing. Next up is the blue areas, which is generally a favorite color of mine to paint because there's a lot of pigment and generally I can get away with only 1 or 2 coats of paint. The mixing process is pretty much the same here, but just wanted to note that while I separated the pieces to make paint application easier, when you have to paint finer details on the same part, be as neat as possible to avoid any headaches later. To do that, I paint the majority of the area with a larger paintbrush, and then fill in the remaining edges with a finer point brush. You can also do it vice versa, with a fine paintbrush first, and then filling the rest of the space with a larger brush. Keeping your lines as neat as possible can seem a little tedious, but I guarantee you it'll save a lot of headache in the long run. For the boot ties, this cork brown color is close to what I'm looking for, but I want it to be slightly more of an intense brown color, so I'll mix in some leather brown. When I mix in colors, I tend to start with the color that's closest to what I want, and I'll adjust the shade 1 drop at a time of the new paint, and mix it each time until I get the color that I'm looking for. Using the color wheel from your source image and comparing it to your paint colors is a great way to see whether or not you want to add a darker or lighter shade of the same base color, or even just straight up black and white. Try to remember the ratio of paint you use, so if you have to add more or clean up lines later on, you can match the same shade of color. I tend to eyeball it and manage to make the shades match, but this is more of a do as I say, not as I do kind of situation. After mixing in some thinner, I used a fine tip brush and a lot of patience to paint in my lines. Going slow is really important, and both this brown and red are less opaque than the blue paint, so it really works out that we kept the lines as clean as possible before. If you mess up, you can use a Q-tip and some water to wick up the paint quickly, or you can wait for it to dry and add in some flat blue and it should cover it up quickly. Now that the first layer is finished, you can see that there are no paint strokes on the application, but that the colors aren't quite opaque enough, so I'll have to go through the entire process again. I'll spare you the time, but just trust that I went through the entire process one more time to ensure good coverage. Next, we'll move on to painting the eyes, and I'll be using some Liquitex Flow Aid to help with that. This is incredibly helpful when I need some sharp, fine lines and a lot of control over the paint. But if you add too much of it, it can break down the stability of your paint. So to have some more granular control about how much Flow Aid is mixed in, I put a drop of paint on one side of my mixing plate and a drop of Flow Aid on the other. And I'll dip between the two and mix in the middle until I get a consistency where it looks like the paint is soaked into the brush, with no excess on the outside. If you feel like it's a little bit too liquidy, you can dip it into the paint additional time, and if it's too thick, you could dip into the Flow Aid an additional time, again just mixing in the middle until you get that right consistency. And then paint like normal. It feels a little different, it's almost like painting with a pen. In my use, the main downside is that the paint can be pretty fragile and can scratch off quite easily. So keep it away from brushing against any surfaces until you can seal it later on with a clear coat. For the pupil, this is even more helpful because I'm using such a fine tip brush. This is the Army Painter Psycho, and with the Flow Aid, I have an incredible amount of control over the application. That and putting this underneath the magnifying lamp is a pure game changer in how I paint the eyes. If you go back to my old videos, I would get so nervous painting the finer details, but with the magnifying glass and this technique, I feel much more comfortable each time I paint a new custom. If there's one thing I can emphasize in this video, it's that it's important to go as slow and as patiently as possible. That'll yield the best results. And with that, we are pretty much set up for highlights, finer details, and the final assembly, which I'll cover in the next part. I hope you all found this helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure you check the description for everything I used in the video, and thank you to all my members who support this channel directly. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Check out part 3 when it comes out, and if you like this video, please drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe.